Silence or stand.
Yes, Mr. Stewart, BCG, you happy to continue?
Yes, Your Honour.
All right, thanks. Yes, when you're ready.
Can I read it on the screen?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. At trial, my father denied all charges against him. It took 6 years and 3 trials before he was finally convicted for the indecent assault of me. The elders who presided over the committee meetings and the appeal committee meetings gave evidence at the committal and at voir dire during the first trial, but the trial resulted in a hung jury. The second trial was declared a mistrial. My father was convicted at the third trial at the end of 2004. He was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. The trials were easy compared to what I had been through with the elders during the committee meetings. I would go through it 20 more times if I had to. At least the court has rules when questioning survivor witnesses. The Jehovah's Witnesses can do and insinuate whatever they want, and there are no protections for the victims at all. I've had no contact with any of the elders involved in the committee meetings or from the Mariba congregation or from the Watchtower since my father was convicted. During my teens, I was at times depressed and suicidal, and this became worse after my father's sexual abuse of me while my mother was away at Expo 88. I also attempted suicide several months after the committee meetings in 1989 as a result of my experience of the committee meetings with the elders. And I couldn't bear the judgment of those around me, the public vilification and ostracism. I wanted to dig a hole and die. My relationship with my mother is now strained but civil. This is because I still hold her partly responsible for the abuse of my sisters and me. To this day, I have never felt I had her full support or protection. The only time I felt my upset feelings were heard was when I went to the police. Nobody else, up until that point, had acknowledged that what my father did to me was wrong and he should be made to answer for it. I have at times lived a life in fear of being ostracised, shunned and vilified by those around me. I have always lived in fear of my father. I have lived in fear of Jehovah. I thought I had done all the right things. I had put my trust in Jehovah, but nobody protected me. They only made it worse. During the criminal trials, I felt as though all my nightmares had gathered together in the one place, and I was terrified that Jehovah would kill me for having reported it to the police and for bringing reproach upon his name. I now have 4 children, of whom I'm fiercely protective. When I separated from my partner last year, I felt like I didn't belong anywhere and didn't really have a name that wasn't associated with an unhappy past. I talked to my eldest son about it, and he suggested that he make up a name for me. He did this, redacted, and made up my current surname. Jehovah's Witness elders sit in judgment of congregation members in relation to matters of wrongdoing. In my experience is that when a person reports wrongdoing, the elders judge that person's credibility as a witness by reference to his or her position in the congregation, their age, their sex, and their outward displays of spirituality. In assessing spirituality, the elders will take into consideration how frequently a person attends and offers answers at congregation meetings, how well they know the Bible, how they are treated by their family and their family's reputation within the congregation, how often they go out preaching, and how submissive they are to the elders. I had reported my father's abuse to the elders because that is what I believed I was supposed to do in accordance with Jehovah's expectations. I thought that Jehovah and the elders would protect me and my sisters. Instead, I felt that rather than protect me as a victim, the elders primarily sat in judgment of me and my credibility as a witness. The elders refused to speak to my younger sisters because of their ages at the time, and they did not even entertain consideration of their credibility as to witness their own abuse. Even when a victim is assessed by the elders as a credible witness, if an alleged abuser denies the allegation, then the elders will only believe the victim's testimony if there are 2 or 3 credible witnesses to the same incident of abuse. That's in Deuteronomy 19:15 and John 8:17. Although they receive reports and investigate wrongdoing and then make assessments as to a witness's credibility, it is my understanding that elders have no training in interviewing, techniques, counselling, or psychology. Elders interview and interrogate child victims of sexual abuse, and in my experience, cause more damage to the victim. In my case, the elders who were friends of my father interrogated me, offered me no emotional support or protection, and made me feel as though I was insulting them and that I was to blame. The Jehovah's Witnesses believe that they should not take one another to court. They use a scripture in 1 Corinthians 6:1-8. I understand that this includes reporting child sexual abuse to the police. I was told and believed that to take such matters outside the church would bring reproach upon Jehovah's name. Child sexual abuse is a crime. The church and the elders have no right to interfere with, prevent, or threaten victims of abuse if they choose to report their abuse to the police. I felt unable to report my father to the police when the events were fresh in my mind and in the minds of others who were or could have been witnesses. If I hadn't been so scared of reporting to the police, I don't think I would have been subjected to such a drawn-out criminal process in which I had to relive the abuse and the subsequent interrogation by the elders over and over again. I feel that children in Jehovah's Witness Church are vulnerable and will continue to be easy targets. This is because, in my experience, the church's current beliefs and practices, such as a rule requiring 2 witnesses to the same event, the practice of dealing with allegations privately and within the church, and the factors that are taken into consideration by elders when determining whether to reinstate a person against whom an allegation of child sexual abuse has been made, appear to favour and even protect pedophiles. I think it is paramount that uniform mandatory reporting laws are introduced across Australia to apply to institutions like Jehovah's Witnesses Church in order to protect children. I believe that making the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society and the church financially accountable is essential for the protection of children and to redress the suffering of past, present and future victims of child sexual abuse within the church. I hope that my traumatic experience of abuse and of the Jehovah's Witness Church beliefs, practices and processes can be used in a positive way. I have come forward today because I want to advocate for all victims who have been sexually assaulted within the Jehovah's Witness Church. I know so many victims of sexual abuse within the church whose fear of repercussion prevents them from coming forward. I would like to promote change and set a precedent by exposing the way my case of sexual abuse was handled and encouraging other victims to speak out.
Thank you, BCG. I just have a few questions to ask to clarify some aspects of your statement, or to ask you to expand on them. Firstly, you deal in your statement with what happens when someone is disfellowshipped from or disassociates from the church, and you describe them as being shunned and ostracized. Do you have experience of people who were disfellowshipped and how they were treated?
Yes, I remember there was a young girl in the congregation who was shunned and ostracised. I remember she got a tattoo, so that was bad, and associated with worldly people.
And what was your experience of the position of family members? In other words, were family members in the congregation also expected to shun or ostracize disfellowshipped or disassociated family members?
Yes, they were. They wouldn't even speak to them.
Did you have experience of that?
For me personally?
No, I mean of people that you knew and you saw this happening.
Oh yes, definitely.
And could disfellowship people still attend meetings of the congregation?
They could attend meetings, but there were rules about where they sat and what time they entered the Kingdom Hall and what time they left the Kingdom Hall.
What were those rules?
I think they had to sit down the back of the Kingdom Hall and not speak to anyone. They couldn't enter the Kingdom Hall until the meeting had already started, and they had to leave prior to the meeting finishing.
You say in your statement that once you left the church, you and your children were completely shunned, ostracized, and actively avoided by members of the congregation. In what way was this done? Can you give any real examples?
Yeah. Well, my family, particularly my oldest sister, wouldn't speak to me anymore. Also, when taking my children to school, there were Jehovah's Witness mothers there with their children, and they used to grab their children away from me and walk around me. So, yeah.
You say in your statement that the police were scary as they were considered to be very bad people. Where did you get this idea from?
I got that idea from the Jehovah's Witness practices and beliefs in a way that they used to liken worldly people in a derogatory sense as like the people in Sodom and Gomorrah. Bad people, not to be trusted.
So what was your experience of how people in the church regarded secular authorities?
It was like they didn't matter. The laws and standards outside the Jehovah's Witness Church didn't matter because they seemed to think that they were the ultimate authority. So that's why nobody's encouraged to report to the police. It should always be dealt with them because, in my belief, they appear to have higher standards and they think they have higher standards than the law.
Did that have to do with being in the world but not of the world?
How do you mean?
Well, if I recall, I may be wrong, that's something you mentioned to me, but if that's not familiar to you or you don't have an explanation of that.
Well, they would say that associating with worldly people would, you know, spoil their good name, beliefs, and maybe they might be influenced by the other people's beliefs, the worldly people's beliefs, I suppose.
And you say in your statement that Ron DeRoy, who was the presiding overseer, quoted scripture which says that Jehovah's Witnesses don't take brothers to court. And then you later in your statement, you record that scripture as being in 1 Corinthians. Do you remember that?
Yes.
If one looks at that scripture, it might be understood as referring to just civil claims between people as opposed to criminal complaints. How did you understand it?
No, it was a blanket rule. There was no distinction between civil claims and criminal. And I believe that's what my mother thought as well.
And how did you come to that understanding?
It was just with my mother, or the belief that I had.
The understanding that the prescription about not taking matters to court, included not taking criminal matters to court. Particularly because there was no distinction. So if there was a wrongdoing in the congregation, you're always told that you had to tell the elders. The legal authorities never even came into the picture. They would often say from the platform and their talks that you shouldn't take a brother to court. So that meant everything. And you say also in your statement that you were taught there was a responsibility to report wrongdoing to the elders within the congregation. What sort of wrongdoing, in your understanding, was required to be reported?
Smoking, things you could be disfellowshipped for, lying, getting a tattoo, over drinking, doing drugs, I suppose, and sexual relations with another person you're not married to, homosexuality. Can't think of any more.
And what
lying. Yep.
And did you have experience as to what the elders did with such reports?
Yeah, I knew that if they looked at that sometimes, and the person wasn't repentant or whatever, they'd disfellowship them. They'd use so all the members of the congregation were mandated to do that. It was like little spies everywhere.
So if the wrongdoing was serious enough and there wasn't sufficient or adequate repentance, then there would be disfellowshipping.
Yes.
When you wrote to the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, essentially complaining about the reinstatement of your father, do you remember that?
Yes.
So your letter's at tab 29. Perhaps we can have it up on the screen. So that's the covering letter. It's being forwarded on by Ron DeRoy, and then starting the next page is your letter. You recognise that letter?
Yes.
And then you received a reply, which is at tab 30. and you mentioned that reply in your statement. How did you respond to that reply, to receiving that reply?
A little bit insulted, I suppose, and I felt like it was a token gesture, particularly where I was counselled to preserve tears in a skin bottle.
Did you feel comforted by that?
Not at all.
And did you know which individual or individuals were behind this letter, who wrote it?
No.
You'll see at the top of the letter, if we can just scroll down a bit. There's a reference there, SD:SSB. Did you know what that represented?
No.
Whether that was a particular individual?
No.
Did it concern you at all that the letter was apparently written anonymously?
I didn't really probably think about that. Given my knowledge of things that were outside the church then, I just saw the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society and figured it was them, their organisation.
Those are my questions, Your Honour.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Yes, Your Honour.
Anyone else? Who should go first?
Probably me in this occasion.
I think that's right.
Thank you. BCG, my name is Coyne. I'm representing Dino Ali, Kevin Baldich, Rhonda Roy, and Alan Pencheth, and some other people that you don't know. So, I just want to ask you only a couple of questions, but you made your complaint to the elders around June 1989. Is that right?
I don't recall exactly when I made it.
My friend will correct me if I've got that wrong. But after you made your complaint to the elders, did they arrange alternate accommodation for you in the congregation?
Initially, I stayed at home with my mother. My father came back she'd invite him in and come back and knock me around.
Yes.
Then once the committee meetings had finished, my sister was counselled and she decided to move back into our house. And I was pretty badly treated by her and my mother at that stage. Even to the point where I couldn't access my bedroom. I'd have to get in through an outside window. And then I remember going to Kevin Bowditch in the walkway of the Kingdom Hall, and I said to him, I can't live here anymore. I don't want to be in the house of my mother.
And they arranged accommodation for you within the congregation, is that right?
Kevin Bowditch arranged for me to stay with Kerry and Mark Grigor. I didn't really know them very well, and I stayed at their house for a while, helped them look after their children. And
You were then married around November 1989.
yes, that's correct.
At the time of your marriage, you were living with the Bowditch family?
Yes.
How long did you live with the Bowditch family?
I don't remember the exact time, but I know that I'd stayed there just before I got married.
Yes. And the Bowditch family assisted you with planning for the wedding?
Planning as in...
Paying?
No, they did not pay for it.
Just the general planning for the wedding in relation to the ceremony?
Yeah, I remember Lynn Bowditch made my little sister's... I bought the fabric and she said she would make their little flower girl dresses.
Yes. And did Kevin Bowditch give you away at your wedding?
Yes, he did. I asked him to.
Okay. After you were married, you moved to Townsville. Is that right?
Are you talking about a particular time? Yeah, I did move to Townsville, yeah.
Yes. So shortly after that.
Oh, no. I had 2 children first and then I moved to
Then
Townsville.
you moved to Townsville. When you were in Townsville, were you still with the Jehovah's Witness faith?
Yes.
Did Ron DeRoy and his family come and stay with you a number of times whilst you were up there?
No, I don't recall him staying. I do remember a photo with them, so they must have visited at one point. But I don't recall him staying with us.
Just to be more specific, during the conventions that were held in Townsville, did they ever stay with you during that?
I can't recall, to be honest. Living in Cairns, he'd left the family home somewhere in Cairns, yeah.
And was he returning during that period of time to your family home?
Yes.
And can you just give a brief explanation of what was going on at that time between your parents?
My parents were separating, and my father had wanted to leave my mother for another woman in the congregation that was married, and he was matching up my older sister with the woman's husband.
But he was coming home to your place during that
yes,
regularly,
yes.
And you were there.
Yes.
And that was during that committee process and during around
Yes.
that period of time.
Yes.
So at that stage, you were having to deal with him outside the committee process in your own home.
Yes.
Would you consider yourself to be a devout at that time that you were abused? Would you consider yourself to have been a devout Jehovah's Witness?
Oh, yes, very.
So the beliefs were very strong beliefs that you held,
Yes.
and throughout the whole period of time that you were a Jehovah's Witness, you felt very strong in your commitment to Jehovah.
Yes, certainly, yes.
Are you able to just assist, perhaps to explain in your own words some of the terms that you've used in the course of your statement? One is a term you've used on a number of occasions, reproach on Jehovah's name. Could you please explain to the Commission, what does reproach on Jehovah's name mean?
It would mean talking or telling anybody that was classified as, or anybody outside the church, about negative things that happened within the congregation, meetings, or with my father, for example. Even, couldn't disclose that. We were pretty much counselled from the platform to keep things within the organisation.
So if you did, if I could say do that, a reproach on Jehovah's name, what did you think the outcome would be? Or what would happen to you?
That not only would you get into trouble by the elders and the congregation disfellowshipped, Jehovah would kill you. definitely.
So when you say Jehovah would kill you, what do you mean? What is your understanding of what would happen? What was your understanding at that time? Sorry, I'll withdraw that. What was your belief at that time about Jehovah killing you?
Well, the Jehovah's Witnesses' foundational belief was that Armageddon was coming, and it was so close that people weren't encouraged to pursue careers, buy houses, anything like that, that they should devote all their time to preaching. So in that sense, it was like it was going to happen in the next year, that Armageddon was going to come, and it was like Judgment Day, and you'd be killed if you weren't in the Jehovah's Witness church.
So you wouldn't be saved as along with the other Jehovah's Witnesses?
No, yes.
And was that a powerful belief?
Oh, yes.
And just in relation to that, if you were defellowshipped, what do you think Jehovah would do to you?
He'd kill you.
So it's the same sort of process?
Same thing, yes.
During the time that you were in the committee, at the committee hearings, I just want to go back to your statement. You missed a line in your statement, but it was the case, wasn't it, that during that committee meeting, your father was brought into the room?
Yes.
And he was at one of those meetings and sat at the end of the other end of the table?
Yes.
How did you feel sitting in that room with the three elders and your father?
I felt extremely uncomfortable talking to the men that were his friends. He's, being his age. And I remember I have never been in my entire life so petrified and scared of my father and his threats and the process.
And what was it that made you talked about your father's threats, but was there anything else that made you feel threatened or petrified?
He was stalking me, and he had that ability to follow through with his threats.
When you were coming back to the committee meeting, when you were in the room, what can you say to the Commission about the tone of the questioning to you?
The tone of the questioning from the elders was almost accusatory, in the sense that, that I was to blame for what happened, or whether I enjoyed it, or it was my fault. And it was almost like they were insulted that I would even speak against my father, who was a brother anointed by a Holy Spirit. And I also felt like they were taking delight, I suppose, in asking the same questions over and over again. I had all different people asking me questions, and my father could say whatever he liked to me. It was very threatening, very scary.
What did you think that they were doing by asking you questions over and over again?
I felt like they were trying to test me, to see if I was lying, whether there were any inconsistencies in my story. And I also felt like I was reliving it all, and they were having fun with that.
When you said in your statement, or you deleted a line from your statement earlier today about having gone to a psychologist, a worldly psychologist. First, I just want to ask you about what your understanding is of a worldly person. what was the idea in your mind about what a worldly person was?
My belief was probably based on the way the Jehovah's Witnesses spoke about worldly people. I actually now think it's quite a derogatory term, and they use it in a derogatory sense, like the worldly people don't have any morals. They're lower than the Jehovah's Witnesses because they seem to hold themselves up having the high moral ground in every part of their lives.
During that period of, say, 1988 and 1989, did you have any friends other than in the Jehovah's Witness congregation?
No.
You went to school, but did you ever associate with any of those, your people that you went to school with outside of school?
Never allowed to associate with them outside.
Were you allowed to engage in extracurricular activities at the school?
Definitely not.
And the sex education, that was not permitted?
Yeah, definitely not.
And that was, and how was that, that was done, wasn't it, by way of a note that was sent to the school that you not participate in certain classes?
My parents were directed by the publications, elders, meetings, to write to the school and write a note that we couldn't participate in sex education classes, birthdays, Christmas, Easter.
At the time, so outside of the Jehovah's Witness congregation, was there anybody that you believed that you could go and talk to?
No.
In terms of seeing seeing any counsellor or psychologist or psychiatrist, when was you have seen a psychologist?
Yes.
When was the first time you went to see or had any engagement with a psychologist?
It wouldn't have been long after I got married, and it was when I had attempted suicide, took an overdose, and I was put into hospital.
And how was...
A psychologist came in then to talk to me, but he was a male, so I wouldn't speak to him.
So you didn't have any counselling at that stage?
No.
When did you or did you ultimately get some counselling?
I eventually, the feelings of suicide just kept getting, they're always there. And given that I had a little son to look after, even though that was a positive for me, it was very hard to fight those feelings, and my nightmares were pretty bad. I sleep, and I went to go see a doctor.
And when was that old?
That would have been after my first son was born, probably about 1.5 years. And I think she prescribed me some medication because I didn't want to talk to any males.
When your father came back into the Mariba congregation, you continued to live there for some years after that.
Yes.
And how did you feel having him in the congregation?
I don't think he came back to live, but he came back when not long after his reinstatement was announced, and I remember him coming to the Kingdom Hall, and I could hear all the brothers and sisters coming up because he was standing quite close to me to, I felt, intimidate me. I was very scared, shaking, and I remember all of the brothers and sisters that knew what he'd done shaking his hand and saying, "Congratulations, welcome back, good on you." And I just felt pretty worthless because he didn't even apologise.
Did you feel, did you ever receive an apology from your father?
No.
Did you ever receive, Well, you've read some of these statements of some of the elders that were involved in the committee meetings, and
Yes.
they have spoken about having provided support to you. What can you say about that?
I am actually probably really insulted that all this time, they have believed that they have supported me. And I think, from my experience, dealing with the different systems, the religious system and secular system, or the legal system, the support, I can compare the support and the processes. So, and I think it would probably hold a bit of weight to those particular elders, Dino, Kevin, Ron, Vincent O'Toole and the Watchtower Society, that their processes aren't processes. There are no processes. There's no protection at all. And the way that they dealt with is very, very traumatic and very difficult to do. And on the other hand, the people that were supposed to be worldly and scary were complete strangers to me, particularly the first detective that I spoke to, Natalie Bennett. And even the people here at the Royal Commission, the team here, they're complete strangers, and I have had more support, acknowledgement and acceptance from complete strangers than I have ever had from anyone in the congregation.
And when you talked about the officer, Natalie Bennett, the officer that was the officer in charge of your case against your father, or the case against your father, I should say. Now, you had a good relationship with her? You trusted her?
Yes.
And initially she was, initially it was a case that you were reluctant to talk to other police, is that?
Oh, yes. I was very nervous making that phone call, very, very scared because of the, obviously not bringing reproach on Jehovah's name. But I initially spoke to a male, and I said to him, can I please speak to a female? And her voice was very caring, non-judgmental, supportive, and she actually reminded me of one of the two people that I was not allowed to speak with in the Mariba congregation. And I remember that she said to me, oh, look, can you do a statement at the place where I live? And I said, she said, you just have to go in and do, and I said, oh, no, I'm not doing it unless I speak to her. So she flew all the way up from where she was and took my statement.
And you just mentioned that it was she reminded you of two people in the congregation that you
One
were...
of two, yeah.
One of two people that you weren't allowed to speak with. Can you explain to the Commission what you mean by that?
My father had specific people that he would not allow me to talk to, even within the Jehovah's Witnesses. Am I allowed to say this person's name?
Probably doesn't. I don't think it matters. Perhaps not to say it.
No. Anyway,
up to you. Sorry.
You could write it down if you want.
Oh, okay. And she was kind to me. She wasn't mean like all of the other women in the congregation, people, males, whatever. And she seemed to have a empathy for me, and a little bit of protectiveness, I think, in Yeah, and I think that's why my father didn't allow me to speak to her.
Were you ever offered any sort of support person during the committee process other than to have your mother involved at one stage?
No, my mother wasn't in the committee meetings. She was only allowed in one. No.
Did you ever indicate to anyone that you would like as some person that you trusted there?
I didn't even know I was allowed to do that.
Were you ever given any biblical guidance from the scriptures about how a person who has experienced sex abuse might deal with it?
Apart from putting my tears in a bottle, in that letter.
And when the letter that you're referring to, that is the letter from that's the letter from the Watchtower and Track Society.
Yes.
To you in response to your letter in 1995. So that was in early 1996.
Yes. There were no talks or talks given from the platform, and normally something, if it was important, it would have been given in not just in the magazine articles. It would be given as a talk to the congregation.
So if there was an issue in the congregation, that would be the subject of a talk at Kingdom Hall.
Yes.
Right. And so a matter of topic would be put up there. And you've experienced a period of vilification. I think you've said after the committee meetings, you felt that people mistrusted you. Sorry, I'll withdraw that. They had said that you had been a liar.
Yes, that's correct.
Was there ever any talks from Kingdom Hall about encouraging the congregation not to speak ill of people who might have made such accusations?
No.
Was there any support given to you at all about your own feelings of shame?
No.
Excuse me. You've said in your statement and to the council assisting that the legal process was a much better one for you. How did it make you feel as a result of that final outcome, obtaining an outcome through the court process?
I'd like to let all the victims know that are listening to this, and the elders, that by going to the police and speaking to Natalie Bennett, and it was the very first time that somebody actually thought that what he did, my father did, was wrong, and he needed to answer for that. I didn't even really know that it was a crime. I mean, and just that acknowledgement and knowing that the court process had rules of evidence and rules. He couldn't just come up and say what he wanted, and he couldn't threaten me. And I felt protected, and I felt supported because they provided counsellors before and after, and they looked after me. And even to this day, I still stay in contact with Ronald Swanwick, which was the DPP at that stage, and the investigator, police investigator Natalie Bennett. So, I still, when you compare that.
And you would agree, nevertheless, that 3 trials was nevertheless a fairly gruelling process of itself. having to give evidence at 3 trials and be cross-examined was of itself a difficult process.
Yeah, it was difficult, but nowhere near as traumatic as what the elders put me through, and the vilification of the congregation in Mareeba. Nowhere near it.
And you've mentioned previously a recommendation about what outcomes you would like to see from this commission. Is there anything further that you would like to see? Like I think you mentioned that you advocate that people obviously go through a legal process, that they go to a police. Is there any other recommendations that you would like to see or changes that you think would assist if a young Jehovah's Witness child was abused, what would assist to ensure that their voice was heard?
I feel that if the mandatory reporting laws were introduced across Australia, given the nature of the Jehovah's Witness organisation and the way they work with their vilification practices, I feel that they could still act in the same way. So from that perspective, I think it is really essential that they need to be financially accountable and also criminally if they don't protect the children in the congregation.
And what about information within the congregation to ensure that that other children are not exposed to a person who may commit a sexual abuse offence?
The practice of reinstating them into the congregation after they said sorry or they appear to be repentant isn't enough. The pedophiles generally reoffend, as in the case of my father, like couldn't control himself with just one daughter, had to assault all of us. I think there needs to be a database, and I honestly believe that once they've offended in the congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses and even externally, that well, particularly in the congregation, because it's like a family network, everybody's trusted, and they don't disclose to other people in the congregation. In fact, if I could just say this, you know, from time to time, witnesses will come and knock on my door, and I normally sort of say, you know, I'm not interested. And one occasion, last year actually, there was a lady that came to my door and she had a son with her, and I felt compelled to tell her to be careful of people in the congregations, particularly those ones that appear to be really righteous. And she was grateful that I said that to her. I said because, and then I explained that I was no longer practicing Jehovah's Witness, and she knew of what had happened to me. She knew who I was. She knew all the details. She was asking me questions. So I think the confidentiality, even, like, the elders speak about their confidentiality and they can't disclose anything to the police or whatever, but all of my details are out there. They've disclosed they protect the accuser in that sense, and my details are out there. Everybody knows what's happened. They've breached my confidentiality.
And did you feel protected at all by the Jehovah's Witnesses?
Definitely not.
Thank you.
BCG, in paragraph 69 of your statement, you mentioned that the elders who presided over the committee and the appeal meeting gave evidence at the committal and at a voir dire during the first trial. Did they give evidence, to your knowledge, in the latter 2 trials?
I don't recall that they did, and I was really quite upset about that because I'd done the right thing and I spoke up straight away while it was fresh in my memory, and I believe they even took notes and details in the meetings, and I thought for sure they'll be able to corroborate that that this happened, instead of me coming back so many years later and all of a sudden out of the blue I've remembered some abuse that's happened. I've said it I've spoken about my father's abuse ever since it's happened, every chance I've gotten. So I was very disappointed that they didn't give evidence.
When they gave evidence at the committal, were they called by the Crown, by the prosecution, or by your father's defence team? Do you remember?
They were called by the DP, yeah, Belinda Merrin, yes. Yes.
Right. Yes. Yes. Mr. Stewart.
I have nothing arising now.
Thank you, BCG. Thank you for coming and telling us your story.
Thank you.
You're now formally excused.
Thank you.